All right. First question is Freud, Sigmund Freud, strengths and weaknesses. Well, the strength of Sigmund Freud. Oh, thank you, Gala. I'm glad you appreciated it. The strength of Sigmund Freud was that Sigmund Freud, he was very, very good at talking to people and understanding how people think. And that was basically what Sigmund Freud did. Is he sat down with prisoners, he sat down with university students, he sat down with people, and he talked to a lot of people. And he just talked to a lot of people and interviewed them and started noticing patterns. And Freudianism is largely based, it's not scientific, right? And that's the biggest critique of it. You can't do an experiment to prove the Oedipal complex. You can't do an experiment to prove that libido and id and ego exist and superego. You can't prove any of that. All of that was based on him just sitting down and talking to a lot of people and noticing a lot of patterns. And it's mainly patterns in how families work. He notices patterns in, how young men relate to their fathers, how young women relate to their mothers, how young women relate to their fathers, how young men relate to their mothers. And he notices certain patterns. And he's observing small children, and he's observing evolution is new and exciting. He's observing monkeys in the zoo, right? And he's observing how baby monkeys interact with their mothers and fathers. And he comes up with a list of concepts and theories, right? He develops the notion of a subconscious. He develops the notion of libido. He develops the notion of the id, the ego, and the superego. Right? He develops all these things. And this is Sigmund Freud. And a lot of it sounds really kooky. And he would coke himself up. He would shoot up cocaine, right? He would inject himself with cocaine, which that's different, right? I mean, snorting cocaine is one thing, but if you're shooting up cocaine, you're using heavy drugs there, right? He would shoot up cocaine and he would get himself fired up, and he would come up with these really complicated theories based on what he observed. And it's not falsifiable, right? You can't do experiments. So it's not really scientific. The thing about Freud, and this is one thing I agree with Jordan Peterson about, is that everything that Freud, pioneered, everything good about him, we don't give him credit for. And all the things we associate with him are things that are kooky, right? And that's the problem. Freud invented talk therapy. It had never been done before. Freud developed the concept of a subconscious, the idea that there are feelings that you're not aware of in your head. You have anger that you might not be aware of. You have feelings that you have not yet become conscious of. The idea of a subconscious mind, that's Freud. Well, the subconscious mind is widely accepted. Talk therapy being beneficial. I mean, it's very widely accepted. People commit crimes and the judge will order them to go to talk therapy, right? It's a really widely accepted part of our culture. That's all Sigmund Freud. So he deserves some credit for that. And he also deserves some credit for the fact that he was very observant, his ability to listen to people and kind of notice patterns and all of that. What he doesn't deserve credit for is that none of it is falsifiable. None of it is falsifiable. And some of it is kooky. Some of it is he takes something that exists and he blows it up into something it's not. And there's many individuals and many writers throughout history who do this, right? Is they discover a truth that is unacknowledged. But because society doesn't recognize that truth that they've discovered as being acknowledged, they kind of blow it out of proportion. And that's a tendency, right? If you know something that society does not know, if you know something that the world does not know or refuses to acknowledge, often because you know that, you will kind of inflate that's importance. Right. And Freud did that. He picked up on a lot of things that people were unaware of: the existence of the subconscious, the value of talk therapy, sexual feelings. At the time, homosexuality was not widely discussed. Other sexual issues were not widely discussed. Well, he's sitting down with people and becoming aware of them. Right. So Freud, he's discovering all these things that society doesn't discuss. And so he blows them up, and the interpretation of dreams, which he's using as a way to get into the subconscious. And that a lot of Freud made some very key discoveries, I would argue. And he had some very astute observations about how families work, how Western, how Western European families, how white families work. He basically came up with certain analysis of how families in the Victorian era in Europe operate, right? And how men feel about their fathers and how, women feel about their mothers. And he developed certain theories and observations about how the Victorian era family worked. He developed certain theories about how you grow up through your life. But, they were quite observant and people were blown away. It was a huge deal at the time when he came out with it. I mean, people would pile into his lectures. He was like, 1901, he publishes his interpretation of dreams. It's like a best-selling book. It's like shaking the world. It was a really big deal when he did it because no one had ever talked that way before. But at the same time, he blows it all up into the crazy stuff, right? And he's coked up he's on cocaine. And of course, no one ever talks about this. So he's going to blow up the importance of it. And Freud thinks all of humanity revolves around sex. And probably the biggest flaw in the Freudian worldview is the same flaw that I see in Marx a little bit, not as much as with Freud, but it's also the flaw in Darwin. And it's the flaw of the modern era. The flaw of modernity is this. Modernity sees man as an animal. An animal, it is fleeing pain, right? And it is seeking pleasure. And that's it, right? It's like a rat in a maze, right? You do experiments with little mice and you can reward them and they will seek that piece of cheese or that pleasure and they will run away from that pain. And it views man as just another animal and just a creature that goes through life seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. And there's nothing more to mankind than that. That is the biggest flaw in Freud. That is the biggest flaw in Marx. That's the biggest flaw in Darwin. Human beings are clearly not just another animal because ants have been making their ant farms the same way for millions of years. And beavers have been making their beaver dams the same way for millions of years. But in just a few thousand years, human beings have done amazing things. There is something unique about humanity. And that thing that is unique about humanity, I would disagree with Marx and Engels and argue that that thing that is different about humanity is not something that is material. It's not just that human beings, we just evolved to the point that we got there was just this special evolutionary leap called a brain. And so therefore, we're different because no one else has ever evolved a special brain before. I don't agree with that. I would argue that mankind does have a spark of divinity within it. I would argue that mankind does have a soul, that mankind does not simply have a material side, but it has a spiritual side. And that's where I would disagree with Freud and Marx and Darwin. And I would argue that their worldview is flawed, right? And that they view mankind as another animal. However, I understand why they made this error. The reason that this is a big problem in modernity is because modernity, humanity is coming out of feudalism. And in the feudal worldview, man is not viewed in material ways at all. Man is simply viewed as purely a spiritual entity, right? And the whole world is viewed in spiritual terms. So radical materialism is something that makes sense in the context of breaking out of feudalism. Feudalism views everything in spiritual terms. So, as you're breaking free from feudalism, you want to see everything in material terms. You're contradicting the old order. You're breaking apart the old order. But, and I agree, Tyler, very good point. But at the same time, there is something spiritual about mankind. And Freud doesn't see it that way. Freud sees human beings as monkeys in a zoo. And he looks at monkeys in a zoo to gain insights into human beings. And he thinks he can explain human beings by observing monkeys in a zoo. That's a problem, right? Because monkeys in a zoo are not humans, and there is a fundamental difference between monkeys in a zoo and a human being. Now, let me add that this becomes very apparent that I do think, I'll be honest, I do think that Sigmund Freud was a bit of a sociopath. That doesn't mean he wasn't very intelligent. A lot of sociopaths are very intelligent, but he was a bit of a predator and he was a bit of a sociopath. That doesn't mean, bad people can make good discoveries. And I actually do draw a lot from Freud because I think he made many, many good discoveries. But I would argue that If you read especially the opening section of his book, Civilization and Its Discontents, and if you take in what he's saying in that book, not the observations he makes, which are very astute. He makes very astute observations in that book, but the worldview that he puts out in that book is the worldview of a sociopath. He starts out by saying that he has a number of clients. Over the years, he's been seeing people, and they're all religious. Freud is an atheist, and he doesn't understand why they are religious. And they all say that they have this feeling of oneness, this feeling of a universal connection to the whole world, this feeling of connection with the universe, this spiritual feeling of oneness. And he says client after client after client tells him they are religious for this reason. And Sigmund Freud writes that he thinks that this is some kind of defect in human beings left over from when we evolved from earlier species. And he thinks this feeling of oneness is, this desire to be part of a whole community, to connect with other people. He argues that this is just some kind of mental defect in human beings, but that it manifests itself in the form of religion. That is a sociopath. Because what Freud is hearing is, yes, people are religious. People join groups. People feel sense of community and sense of loyalty to groups. And people feel loyal to their families. They feel loyal to their countries. They feel loyal to their community and to their religion and their cause. And Freud, he can't relate to that at all. And he's just like, yeah, all these clients, they tell me that they're religious, and it's not because of some rational arguments about God. It's because they have this deep connection, this feeling of oneness, and he can't make any sense of it. That indicates to me that he's a sociopath, right? That he's, and that there are these people called sociopaths that are not able to have empathy for other people. They're not able to get that feeling of that sense of community, that feeling of oneness. And I think that Freud, was somewhat of a sociopath. And the way he ends the book, Civilization and Its Discontents, the way he says basically, maybe civilization isn't worth it after all. Maybe it was all a big waste of time. Maybe we should just be savage beasts running through the woods. I mean, I don't really know. I mean, that's like a weird conclusion to come to. And also people say that the way Freud interacted with his clients was predatory. There's a letter that gets referred to where Sigmund Freud is traveling somewhere. And he says he can't stay for very long because he's afraid that his clients will heal in his absence, meaning that these people might realize they don't need to pay him lots of money to sit on his couch. That's cynical. And that to some degree, and he also, Sigmund Freud said, there's a quote, he says, money for me is like laughing gas. The more of it I get, the more happy I am. That's pretty, that there was a cynical edge to Sigmund Freud. That while Sigmund Freud was making very astute observations about human beings and how they relate to each other, while he was doing that, he was exploiting rich people for money. That was really a lot of what he was doing. He was sitting down with rich people and telling them what they want to hear and getting to know them so they would give him money. Right? There was an element of that he was entertaining rich people. He was doing some kind of self-help therapy thing, but there was an element of he was trying to get rich people to give him money, right? And that it was, to some degree or other, there was a predatory aspect to what he did. And he slept with a lot of his clients, which is not ethical, right? Modern therapy of all kinds forbids that, right? You can't sleep with your clients if you're a therapist, but he apparently did. He slept with many of his clients, and he argued that that was inevitable. So there was an element of predatory grifting and sexual predatory behavior with Sigmund Freud. And if you read a lot of his writing, he's got a sociopathic, he doesn't relate. And in a way, his sociopathy may have helped him, right? Because he wasn't wrapped up in these relationships, right? Because he didn't have strong feelings about his family. He didn't have strong feelings about his country or his religion, right? Because of the fact that he was just he had this cold sociopathic way of being that may have actually helped him observe it in a more neutral way. So whatever, right? Sigmund Freud was, He was an interesting one, and I think his work is very valuable. And I actually take a lot from psychoanalysis. I think that psychoanalysis is very useful in understanding people and how to relate to them. But at the same time, Sigmund Freud was a predator. I mean, Sigmund Freud was probably a sociopath, and on top of that, he didn't have the whole picture. He understood some things. He came to some big discoveries, but he kind of inflated them, and none of it is falsifiable. None of it's scientific. None of it is scientific. You can't prove any of it. So there you go.